At least let's start with, you could ask a question right now. I'm not sure if you raise your hand with your hand or with the hand raise function. It's possible I won't see it. So if you raise your hand and I don't see it, just say something. Okay. Also, I would appreciate it.
The recording is being recorded.
At least let's start that was with recording. You could ask a question right now. So I would appreciate if I could see your faces, because that way I'll know. I'm not sure if you raise your hand with your hand or with the because you don't have hand raise function. All right. So I won't see what's the fundamental? Raise your hand and I don't see it. That I have. Say something. Okay. Also, I would appreciate my arrow.
The recording has this meeting is being the recording has this meeting is being recorded.
Joint in nature symbolized by with recording. You could ask a question right now. Perception and cognition. I would appreciate if I could see your faces, because that way I'll know if you raise your hand with your hand or with the hand raise function. In addition, I think that I won't see it. If you raise your hand and I don't see it, that I have. But there can also be a lot of. Also, I would appreciate my arrow.
The recording has this meeting is being the recording has this meeting is being recorded.
Joint in nature symbolized by with recording. You can ask a question right now. The fundamental properties, according to me, are that perception is iconic, non-conceptual, non-propositional, and I'm leaving room for some element of modularity, although I have yet to see any way of putting that really works. The iconic aspect is format. That's why it's fundamental, because the format of a representation is fundamental to that representation. The issue of conceptuality and propositionality, those may apply to contents or maybe the states. I'll explain that difference later. Of course, the modularity is a matter of cognitive architecture. So according to me, cognition can use perceptual representations with these fundamental properties, but they're not, for example, when you use your perceptual imagination to try to tell whether the sofa will fit through a doorway. But according to me, they are not constitutive of cognition. They're not what's most fundamental to cognition. So here's the plan. I'm going to start with modularity. Then I'll move to how we can tell perception from cognition. And then, yes, is there a question? Nope. Okay. I'll talk a little bit about animals, and then I'll talk about a certain feature of perception called categorical perception, and then I'll talk about babies, and then I'll talk about propositions. So that's the plan. And look, if there are a lot of questions and we don't get to the last one, that's fine. Okay, modularity. As I'm sure everybody knows, in the early 80s, well, moving back a little further, in the 1940s and 50s, the new look in perception held that there was extreme saturation of perception by theory and cognition. Very nicely expressed in Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he made heavy use of a famous experiment from, I think, the late 1930s by Brunner and Postman. And then in the 80s, Jerry Fodor and Zenon Plishin argued that there is no cognitive penetration of perception, where they defined that as the function it computes is sensitive in a semantically coherent way to the organism's goals and beliefs. And they, one of their main pieces of evidence was illusion. So here is a famous illusion. This yellow line looks longer than this one, even though they're the same size. And even though when you can see parallel lines showing that they're the same size, it still looks longer. So they argued there was no cognitive penetration. But what we've learned since then, and really we really even knew then, but they didn't apparently know it, is that there are a lot of ambiguous figures where when you're told what they are, it determines or it can determine what you see. So here's a pretty famous one. I don't know how many people have seen this. Oh, good. I don't see anybody who's seen this. It's like nobody's seen it. Okay, so this looks like a normal brick wall. Maybe there's a stone in the middle of the brick wall. Is that how you see it? Raise your hand if that's how you see it. Okay, but there's another way of seeing this, and once I tell you about it, you won't be able to go back to the first way. So this is a cigar, and this is the ash of the cigar. Cigar, ash of cigar. I don't know if you see it that way now. So the cigar is sticking out of the wall. And once you see that, you can't go back. And you can get to see that. I've done this many times with people just by telling them, but I took a little bit of a shortcut of using a pointer. So here's another case. I have a lot of these cases. This may look like a bunch of patches, but you can also see it as a cow. These are the nostrils of the cow, the eyes of the cow's ears. Again, once you see it as a cow, it's a little hard to go back. Now, these phenomena are probably or maybe attentional phenomena, but we have some experimental evidence that contravenes the modularity thesis, that attention can change brain representations. So this experiment used superimposed pictures, and they used a method of frequency tagging. So here we are in V1. The 2 Hertz tag is a tag of a face, and the 1.5 Hertz tag is the tag of a house. So they've oscillated those pictures at that rate. And let's focus in on V1 and the fusiform face area. Oops, my cursor seems to be fusiform face area and the parahippocampal place area. The blue is when people attended to a face, and the red is when they attended to a house. And what you can see in the fusiform face area is that when people attended to the face, they got a big boost to the 2 Hertz signal. And when they attended to the house, they got a big boost to the 1.5 Hertz signal. And notably, these 2 boosts are bigger than the comparable boosts in V1, suggesting that there's a direct effect of feature-based attention on face representations, and also, but to a lesser degree, on the house representations that's not mediated by spatial attention to one part of the picture. So this really strongly, this is a really cool result, I think, that strongly suggests that that there is a direct effect of feature-based attention, and that goes contra to the modularity thesis. So any questions about that? Okay, I don't see a question. So now I'm going to move to the question of how we can tell perception from cognition. Is there any method of telling the difference? Well, one method is one that was known to Aristotle, who said, when persons turn away from looking at objects in motion, for example, rivers, and especially those which flow very rapidly, things really at rest are seen as moving. This is a famous, the first mention, as far as I know, of the Waterfall Illusion, but at least in the US is called the Waterfall Illusion. So I'm just going to demo one thing. So if you could focus on that plus, and I'm going to ask you to focus on that plus for 30 seconds. I'm going to time 30 seconds. And then I'm going to show you another picture, and I would like to hear somebody tell me what they see in the second picture. Okay, but keep your eyes glued to that fixation point. Okay, I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, go, and then the other picture will come up, and I need you to focus on what you see if you keep your eyes on the plus. 1, 2, 3, go. Anybody want to say what happened? I can't hear anybody saying anything, but I see some mouths moving. You have to, can they unmute themselves, Corrado?
Yeah, can I mute people?
It was colorful and then black and white.
Yeah, so you got an after effect, and then it quickly dissipated.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, so that's the standard result. I mean, it would be better if I waited for a minute instead of 30 seconds, but that's pretty good. Now, everybody knows about color after effects, but they're way cooler after effects in high-level visual properties. So after effects that have to do with a face identity, face gender, and another one that I'm going to show you, numerosity. How many people have seen this stimulus? I don't see. Okay, good. I'm glad this is unknown. Okay, we're going to do a numerosity one. Focus your attention on that red dot. This one is a little harder to get, so I'm hoping that everybody will really keep their eyes glued to that red dot. Then I'm going to show you another stimulus, and I need you to immediately make a judgment as to whether there's more dots on the right or more dots on the left. Okay, and then I'm going to ask for somebody to tell me whether there's more. It seemed as if there were more dots on the right or more dots on the left. But you really need to keep your eye on that red dot, otherwise it won't work. Okay, I'm going to say again, 1, 2, 3, go. 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, somebody want to say what you saw initially?
I think that the first impression was very strong, but there were more on the right.
Yeah, good. That's right. That's the expected result. Okay, this is done in Burr's lab in Pisa, and Burr and Ross, and so the explanation is that we have perceptual channels that are divided in parts of the visual field. Channels on the left for high numerosity and channels on the right for low numerosity. So this is strong evidence, and there's lots of strong evidence that we have high-level perceptual channels for perceptual channels for high-level visual properties. Where by high level, I mean not something computed in the eye or an really early vision. So this is somewhere in, the neural base of these is in the parietal cortex. This is way up in the visual system. Okay, so the idea here is that you have channels for high numerosity that are fatigued on the left, channels for low numerosity that are on the right that are fatigued, so-called fatigued. And then when you look at this, which, oh, by the way, I didn't say, these are exactly the same. And then you had a preponderance of high on the right and a preponderance of low on the left. So it looked like there's more on the right, even though I didn't actually show you this. Every dot here is paralleled by a dot here, and conversely. These are the same figure on the left and the right. Yet it looked like there were more on the right. So that's it's a really cool example of how we adapt in a retinotopically specific way to high-level properties. And this is throughout the high level. It's hard to find adaptation results that aren't retinotopic or spatiotopic. So here's another way of telling the difference between perception and cognition. We all know about these, modal and amodal contours. And here is a graph showing that they happen extremely quickly. The red is, I won't go into the difference between modal and amodal, but you see the difference emerging, I don't know, I think this is about 60 milliseconds. So it's fast. It's faster than thought. So furthermore, this occurs in many different creatures, cuttlefish, bees, chicks. So you may want to wonder, though, how do we know how fast thought is? I say they're faster than thought, but how do we know that that's true? And which organisms have thoughts? How do I know that bees don't have thoughts? Well, I think that the answer is that there is a certain circularity here, that we have a bunch of tests like adaptation and illusory contours and stuff like that, and many more, and speed, and those converge on the same phenomena. They tell you the same things about which phenomena are perceptual and which ones are cognitive. So you can use those phenomena like adaptation for a preliminary determination of which states are perceptual and which states are cognitive. And the fact that they all agree shows that the circularity is benign. Although there is circularity here, I don't think it's a problematic circularity. So any questions about that? Okay. Now I've been talking about ways of telling versus what it is. Here are ways of telling whether someone has a fever. But what it is to have a fever isn't what any of those ways of telling are. It's to have a body temperature above normal. Similarly, we can ask the question of whether there are ways of telling whether a state is a perception. And then I've shown you a bunch that I think are good. But what a perception is, according to me, is something more fundamental about the perceptual representations, namely that they're iconic, non-conceptual, and non-propositional. So that's an important distinction. Now I'm going to say a little bit about terminology. So the word concept is used in quite different ways. There's a sense in which it's more like a meaning, where we say that words for dog in different languages all express the same concept. That's more common in philosophy. But then there's a representational sense where it's a kind of representation in your brain. And that's the sense that I'm talking about. And in that sense, a cognitive representation is a representation used in thinking, reasoning, deciding, planning, evaluating, formulating a report, long-term memory, and things like that. And the sort of behavioral indicator of categorical perception is you have faster and more accurate discrimination between colors on either side of a boundary than within a single band. So that's the sort of behavioral indicator of it. But of course, the phenomenal indicator of it is it looks like the things in the same category look similar in a certain way. So here's the interesting thing is, and this is what my claim is anyway, is that infants have categorical perception of color before they have conceptual abilities. It's very important to distinguish these categorical perception from concepts. Concepts are involved in thought, but babies have categorical perception before they have those conceptual abilities for color. Now, you may wonder how we know what pre-linguistic infants see. And what's wonderful is that there are these methods, a number of different methods for probing the perception of non-linguistic creatures, including pre-linguistic babies. So I'm going to heavily use some of the work of Anna Franklin, a developmental psychologist at Sussex. So she uses a number of techniques, but one cool technique is this is wonderful in its simplicity, is you have a a screen of one color and a disc of a different color. And if the baby sees it as a different color, the baby just moves its eyes to that disc. And adults do this too. If you see an expanse with a different color on it, you move your eyes to it. Now, here's an interesting thing, which is that they move their eyes more quickly if the background and the disc are of different color categories, allowing the experimenter to detect those categories. Everybody get this method? Okay, another method she uses is a looking time method. This was pioneered by a psychologist named Robert Fantz in the 1960s. And what he did was, here's an infant. I don't know if you can see the infant here. Is that visible? There's an infant lying down here, and there's Fantz looking at the infant and presenting stimuli to the infant on a screen. And then he can see where their eyes are looking. And so he can see how much time they spend looking at various things. They spend a lot of time looking at a face, very little time looking at a blank screen, a little tiny bit more looking at a colored screen. So here's the modern method of doing it. You have a screen, a camera above the screen. You have somebody who can't hear, who can't hear anything that's going on while the baby looks. Cool thing. So this is a habituation study. It's a second method. The first method was they move their eyes. The second method is habituation. And the way habituation works is you show the baby the same, this is one form of it, the same thing on the left and the right, same color over and over again. What you find is the baby stops looking at the screen, okay? It is said the baby gets habituated to what's on the screen. This is not the same thing as adaptation. This is boredom. They look at their feet. Then, if you show them something a different color that they see as a different color, of course, not all colors for very early on, 1 or 2 months, they won't see something as a different color that we think of as a different color. But if the baby sees a different color, they rekindle their interest as indicated by looking time. And then, if you move it to the other side, they'll look to the other side. And so you can formulate a notion of novelty preference, the time spent looking at the novel stimulus divided by the total test phase looking time. And that gives you an index of categories of colors. And it coincides, it determines the same results as the one where you move your eyes, and also some other methods, including some neural methods, oddball effects, and things like that. And here is one of Anna Franklin's slides, which shows you this is a depiction of the categories of infant vision all over the world. So where there are lines between boxes, that's where the infant sees those as of the same category. So there's a category of greenish, there's a category of bluish. The gap here, it shows there means that this is a category boundary. And infants all over the world have 5 color categories, which we can give rough names to in English. And the world's languages correspond to some extent to those categories. And English has, so the white disc is where the infant draws a category boundary. And the stars are where a particular language draws a category boundary that coincides with the infant boundary. English has 3, but there's a Nigerian language that has none, and the language spoken in Ecuador has 1. So the world, this has been done cross-culturally, and different languages have categories that correspond more or less well to the baby categories, but the baby categories are the same everywhere. So any questions so far? Okay, I don't see any questions. Well, here comes the crucial section. This is the first section where I'm going to give you really serious evidence for non-conceptual perception. And it's evidence that 6 to 11-month-olds have no color concepts. So the argument is supposed to be that 6 to 11-month-olds show color perception without showing the abilities diagnostic of color concepts. So here's the idea. We have 6 to 11 months here. This is earlier, this is later. And in this period, they don't have good color perception. In this period, they do have good color perception, and also this one, of course. But in this period, they start having conceptual abilities with respect to color. But in here, no conceptual abilities, okay? Now I'm going to show you some experiments that show that. So this is Wilcox 1999, an experiment in which a ball is rolled behind a screen and then emerges from the other side, or appears to emerge from the other side. And the key condition is when a green ball rolls in and a red ball rolls out. Now, if a box slides in and a ball slides out, 4.5-month-olds show increased looking time indicating surprise, but not if a red ball turns into a green ball. By 7.5 months, they can use kind information. If a duck turns into a truck, they're surprised, but still no color. It isn't until 11.5 months that they use all three. So this suggests, one of many experiments that suggests that children between 6 and 11 months cannot use color to formulate expectations. That is a conceptual use, to formulate expectations about what will happen. Okay, what was that? I heard something. What? Was that a question? Or? I'm hearing an echo. Uh-oh, are you all hearing that echo? Am I the only one hearing it? Can't hear you, Corrado.
Sorry, there was another microphone. There was a...
okay, no problem. Okay, so this experiment makes it look like 6 to 11-month-olds do not notice color. Now, from this experiment, you might think, oh, maybe they have the concept of color, but not the concept of color as a permanent feature of things. Maybe they think of color as a very temporary feature of things that just can change all the time. But this experiment rules that out. So this is Jean-Remy Hawkman. Oh, and again, I'm not getting the whole slide on there. What's going on here? I'm sorry, I didn't have this box adjusted properly. Okay, so what Hawkman did was he tried to teach 12-month-olds rules about some event that they would think of as interesting. So he shows them, say, same shape on the screen, and in one condition, same shape, either the same circular shape or same triangular shape, predicts something very interesting that will happen on either one side or the other. Like it might predict a jumping, squealing frog on the left, something that they're very interested in. And they learned that rule. They learned same shape predicts frog on the left. But they could not learn, they were just starting to get same color predicting something. So that suggests that even at 12 months, they're just starting to get the use of color. But notice that this doesn't involve color as an abiding or permanent feature of something, because the only issue is, would they know that same color right now, the same time slice of color? So this shows that they don't have, or at least evidence that they don't have a concept of color as a permanent, as either a temporary thing or as a permanent thing.
Sorry, Ned, may I have a question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, this means perhaps that may have a concept of shape, but not concept of color.
Yes.
They use shape for predicting or category as a kind of predictor, as a feature or predicting feature of something, but not color. This means that this is interesting, because it seems to me that sometime in the developmental psychology debate, the discussion is about using, if infants are using concept or not And you are suggesting that depend on what kind of concept they are using. Maybe they can use shape concept before, then color, other concept before, then other kind of concepts. So the question is not yet they are using concept or not using concept, but depend on kind of concept they are using.
Exactly. Now, just to be careful here, I may have overstated it. I'm not really claiming that they have shape or kind concepts. I'm claiming that they have some conceptual abilities with regard to shape and kind. They may not be full concepts. To have the full concept of shape, maybe you have to be able to do various things that they can't do. But they certainly have some conceptual abilities, but as of now, nobody has shown any conceptual abilities with respect to color. So I would prefer to say that they're on their way to getting shape and kind concepts. Okay, here is another experiment. This is one where you have a screen, you have something of one color go out from one side, another color go out the other side, and then they don't expect two things, even at 12 months. And the general rule here is that babies use shape and kind information in forming expectations about number much earlier than they use color. So they get the conceptual abilities, at least some conceptual abilities, for shape and kind that way before they get color. So look, the general form here is a move from absence of evidence to evidence of absence. And now that's not generally a good form. But look, if you keep looking for conceptual abilities and you don't find them, I think in the end you have to conclude that they're not there. So that's where I am on this. Now, here is an interesting difficulty for my view, which is maybe the 6 to 11-month-old child's color perception is non-conceptual, but the adult's color perception is conceptual. So I'm trying to argue that it's a hallmark or fundamental feature of perception that it's non-conceptual, but I'm subject to a problem here. Maybe adults have conceptual color perception. And there's actually some evidence for this. And here's the evidence. This is also from Anna Franklin. So these bars, this is the time, remember I showed you this slide where you have a uniform color and then you have a disk of a different color. So the question is, how long does it take? The categories are indicated by how long it takes you to move your eyes to the different color. So what she finds in infants is that on the left, in the left visual field, right hemisphere, this is the initiation time. There's a longer initiation time within category, that's these dots, than between category. Okay, so that is indicative of categorical perception. And what this suggests is categorical perception on the left, but not on the right. But adults have categorical perception on both the left and the right, in fact, stronger on the right, which you might expect because of language in the left hemisphere. So that suggests that maybe adults have both non-conceptual color perception in the right hemisphere and conceptual color perception in the left hemisphere. And that would be very bad for my claim because then there would be conceptual color perception. So any comment or question about this? Okay, now it turns out there's wonderful evidence against this. Wonderful evidence against adults having conceptual color perception. And I'm going to show you what the strongest piece of evidence. And I'm pleased to have discovered this in a journal only a few weeks ago. So this is a great article from my point of view in Neuroimage, published a few weeks ago. So here's what they did. This is a wonderfully simple, this is a decoding experiment. So they looked at the brain when people are seeing colors and also orientations for where you could decode the color they were seeing and the orientation they were seeing. So, they did a searchlight analysis of the whole brain, and looked for the places that show that they could decode the stimulus from. Now, what they did was they used 48 colors in 12 bins, is indicated by these. Now, here's the way the experiment worked. You show a Gabor patch on the left and a Gabor patch on the right. They are different in orientation and color. Then 400 milliseconds, that's 300 milliseconds. 400 milliseconds later, you give them a test of what color it was on which side or which orientation it was. So they don't know in advance which side they're going to have to respond to. So there could be a circle here on the left or on the right, and they have to move a cursor to say if it's on the left, they have to say, move a cursor to this color, okay? Everybody, did I say that right? Did everybody get that? Or an orientation. So they have to make a judgment as to what was here, both either orientation or color, and that makes sure that they focus on both, okay? Everybody get that part? All right, then they don't have to do anything else. But the experimenters look in their brain in the first 1,000 milliseconds here, the first second, to see where they get decoding. And what they find is really strong results. It's all in the back of the head, contralateral to where the stimulus was, which strongly suggests the visual cortex for this. And this is for color. One of the, where's my cursor? Color on the left and orientation on the right. And this is left minus right for color and for orientation. It's virtually the same result for color and orientation. And if there is conceptual color perception, you would not expect this result. You would, if there is conceptual color perception, especially verbally mediated, you would expect to see language areas on the left light up and some frontal cortex light up because that's where concepts are. And they did not see that. And here is what they say about it. Activity in posterior electrodes contralateral to the decoded stimulus were the primary contributors to the decoding of both features, that is color and orientation, suggesting that visual sensory processing was the main source of decodable signals, ruling out alternative explanations such as verbal labeling. And another feature of this is that it was fast. Their best results were between 150 and 350 milliseconds. So the upshot is back of the head, contralateral, fast, all indicating no verbal or conceptual coding. So the global workspace doesn't even get activated to at the earliest 270 milliseconds, and it takes a long while, maybe 500 milliseconds, 400 to 500 before it's really going. This suggests little or no conceptual involvement. So I take that to be strong evidence against the theory that even in adults, color perception is conceptual. Notice that I'm not claiming any upshot for consciousness here, because nothing was tested particularly about consciousness, but of course, you couldn't do this if you weren't conscious of the stimuli, but nothing was really, there's no direct test of that, but it wouldn't take much if somebody wants to do this experiment to add some indicator that the subjects really were consciously aware of these things. And then I think you would have pretty strong evidence against the global workspace theory of consciousness, because it's fast. 150 to 350 milliseconds, it really doesn't look good for the global workspace, if you ask me anyway. Any questions about that study?
Yeah, I got one. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you anyway.
So I was wondering, there is no, should we not make a first, conceptual distinction here about vehicle and content property, which is something that I don't see in this,
What's the first one? Content is the second.
Content and vehicle property. So, I mean, it seems like...
What's the first? I don't get that word. What's the word?
Content and vehicle property. Vehicle.
Oh, vehicle. Vehicle.
Sorry about,
I'm sorry, vehicle.
My,
okay,
my
yeah,
fault
yeah.
was like, so it seems like we're talking at the same time about phenomenological properties, so properties about content, so
Yeah.
how we do experience color, and on the other, we are trying to map onto like vehicle property, which is something that someone might, let's say, argue against or criticize as a sort of like conceptual movement between the two.
Yeah.
Or maybe
Okay.
I'm getting wrong. Does it make any sense? Like,
yeah, I understand. Okay, so I made a distinction between non-conceptual content and non-conceptual states, which includes the vehicle. So my view is that content can be shared between conceptual and non-conceptual states. I think that a conceptual state and a non-conceptual state can overlap in content, even potentially have the same content if they both represent red, for example. So this is a tricky issue and does depend a lot on kind of maybe somewhat verbal issues about how you decide to use the word content, which after all is a term of art. It's a technical term and people do use it somewhat differently from other people. But my notion of non-conceptual is a state notion, which includes the vehicle. So I'm not worried about the content vehicle distinction here. What I'm saying is children between the ages of 6 months and 11 months can have perceptions of color without any concept of color. So whether that concept of color depends more on the vehicle or more on the content, I don't have to take a stand on that. I'm just arguing you can perceive color without being able to think about it. That's really what I'm saying. So the distinction between content and vehicle is an extremely important distinction, but it's not important for this particular claim. If they don't have the concepts, they don't have conceptual color perception. So that's really what I'm caring about. Now, whether this is content, look, I think there is certain vehicle property. It depends, the fact that they can't think about the colors is a restriction on what's sometimes called the conceptual role. And that is, of course, the role of the representation, the role of the vehicle. So I wouldn't say it's a vehicle property exactly. It's a property of the role of the vehicle, which is a different thing. Anyway, that's the best I can do on that. Okay, any other questions about this? Okay, so here's another bit of evidence, is that if you show people targets of a different color category from the background, the time it takes to move your eyes to that target is the same for both hemispheres, whereas there's no advantage for the left hemisphere as you would expect for verbal concepts. And presumably, conceptual process in addition would take additional time. So that's another piece of evidence. So an interim conclusion here is that 6 to 11 months old infants have color perception without color concepts, and there's some evidence that adult color perception does not involve an extra conceptual representation. Now, that's not all the evidence. I have more evidence of a different kind, and it's quite striking. It's that, I should say, by the way, none of this is about high-level perception. This is all about, it's colors, it's low-level. I don't have comparable evidence for high-level perception, although I believe the same is true of high-level perception. Okay, here's my other kind of evidence. Okay, so we're talking about the period between 6 and 11 months. Children get these initial conceptual abilities for color at around 12 months. But it takes them another 2 years to learn the basic color words. And this is an experiment done by Mabel Rice. They don't get 4 basic color words, at least in 1980 in the US until they're 3 years, 3 months old. This differs a lot from language to language, but Mabel writes of this great experiment. She took 2 to 3 year olds who knew no color words and taught them the difference between the word red and the word green. It took over 1,000 trials over several weeks. They just couldn't learn it. And anybody who's had a 2-year-old child knows that it can be really difficult to teach them color words. And Charles Darwin, there's a great quote from Darwin. He says, "I attended carefully to the mental development of my young children, and with 2, or as I believe 3 of them, soon after they had come to the age when they knew the names of all common objects, I was startled by observing that they seemed quite incapable of affixing the right names to the colors and colored engravings. Although I tried repeatedly to teach them, I distinctly remember declaring that they were colorblind." And a term coined in Germany in the early 20th century for this is Farbendummheit, color stupidity. Now, I should say that this is a changing thing. Kids get the color words ever earlier. After all, look, this is what they see. This is what they used to see. Well, I guess plants and fruits too, but in the turn of the 20th century in Europe, the early IQ test, I think this was mostly done in France, suggested that children did not get the 4 basic color words until they were age 7. In 1980, it was 3 years, 3 months, and now work by Dave Barner suggests it's even earlier, because after all, they are just bombarded with shiny colored things. In any case, here's a summary so far. Infants can see colors at near adult levels at 4 to 6 months. They perceptually categorize colors. They can use shape, size, and kind information. 6 months earlier, they can use color information. 2 years later, most children do not know the basic color words. And substantial reasoning seems to happen at the same time as learning colors. Maybe that's when they get the full color concepts, even though the color conceptual abilities start emerging at 12 months. So my conclusion here is that 6 to 11-month-old infants have color perception, probably without color concepts. Now, I have one more section, but I see that I am really very much out of time. So I think maybe we should just go to the question period. I should skip the last section. What do you think, Corrado?
So I think that we have time if the last section is not 1 hour, but
well, I don't want to short circuit the question period.
Okay, so I think that we have time for the last session, and then we have a question.
Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just begin the last section.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So here's the basic point about the last section: is that perceptual representations don't have a logical role of propositional representations. So you can see something as red, but not as if red then blue. You can see something as non-blue by seeing it as red, but one can not see anything simply as not blue. One can see something as intermediate or indeterminate between red and blue, like purple, but not as having the disjunctive property of simply being red or simply being blue. And likewise for conjunction, universal quantification, existential quantification. So points like this have been made by Tim Crane and Tyler Burge. My interpretation is that they're more focused on this internal logical structure that I just described. Whereas for my purposes, what really counts is this, what you might call external logical relations, that perceptual experiences cannot be premises or conclusions in reasoning. So that's what my argument depends on. But I think this is evidence for this. And the reason it's evidence is that many forms of inference depend on logical structure that perception does not have. So take, for example, the disjunctive syllogism. P or Q, not P, so Q. that can't happen with perception because perception doesn't have that internal logical structure. Of course, it doesn't rule out some kind of very atomic color, use of color, like that is red entails that is colored. So it's not a totally powerful, it's not a dispositive argument, but I think it's a fairly strong argument. Okay, so what I was going to do is, and I'll just do a selection from these studies. I'm going to, well, here's one interesting phenomenon. This is a question of whether there's non-verbal understanding of disjunction before kids can use the word or in its sense of logical sense. So these are kids with lots of words and they use the word or, but they show little or no verbal understanding of disjunction until over 2.5. So here, this is the test of this is a really very cool experiment. So here's the way it works. You show the kid a tube and you drop something down a tube with two ends. And the kid, you're dropping in things the kid wants. They're stickers or pieces of candy or something. And the kids are told if it hits the table, they can't have it. So their job is to catch it. And what young children do, but this is an older child who's holding her hands under both tubes. That's the rational thing to do if you have the concept of disjunction or, you know, strong conceptual abilities about disjunction. But the younger children don't do it, and apes don't do it. So here's a graph of, this is a trial number, and this is percent of times that they held their hands under both openings. So this is, the black is great apes. And what you see here is that it's only after, oh gee, my cursor is really disappearing. Can you see the cursor on the screen? Yes?
Not now.
Oh yeah.
Not now.
Not now. It's funny. It's suddenly not working. I don't know why that would be.
Yeah, it's okay. It's sometimes it's coming and sometimes it's
vanishing. Yeah. Okay. So I can't see it, but look. Anyway, just look at that black line at the bottom, and what you see is it took until trial number 8 before even 10% held their hands under both tubes, and they never got above 10% after 12 trials. The next curve above that, the sort of light beige or pink curve, is for 2-year-olds, and they're only a little bit better than the apes, and they never got up to more than 40% of holding both hands like in the picture. It takes really until the red line of age 3 before kids really do well at this. So this suggests little or no non-verbal understanding of disjunction at age 2 to 2.5, even when they're talking a blue streak. So again, it looks like the full concepts only come in with the words. Okay, I think I'll just mention one more thing, which is only perceptual features can be directly used in visual search. So this is indicated again. Now my cursor's back. So this is a phenomenon called pop-out. The red thing pops out. If you try to find the red thing here, you have to do a slow serial search. And here is a graph of that. This is reaction time. If the distractors are all very similar to each other, the distractor set size doesn't matter much. But if they're not similar, then you have to do these slow serial searches. And this, by the way, this graph is for pigeons. So this is not special to humans. I like to use the pigeon graph. And, many features pop out. You can see a face pop out here. So here's the interesting thing. This is about negation. Absences don't pop out. So you can see the presence of a line, it pops out, but the absence of a line on this one, very hard to see. I don't know how many people can see it. You have to do a slow serial search for that to find the absence of a line. I'm going to point the cursor to it. There it is. But it's not easy to see. It does not pop out. Similarly, on the left of the lower one, there is a pop out for a bump among the ovals. See, there it is. But what about oval among the bumps? No, you don't see it on the right. So an oval is the lack of a bump. So that shows that the bump is the perceptual feature, not the lack of it. So again, suggesting that we don't have negation in vision. And the same with conjunction. This is a conjunctive search. This is a conjunctive search versus a single feature search. Conjunctions don't pop out either. Again, so pop out may or may not be necessary for perceptual representation, but its absence is an indicator that a representation is not genuinely perceptual. So I think I may just stop there and just go to this slide.
Thank you so much, Ned, for the marvelous talk. Okay, for the questions, so that's Luca Bellini. So you?
No, I was actually just clapping like through the reaction button. Sorry.
So, are there questions? Assistant. Okay, Quentin, Giuliano, Quentin, please.
Yeah, hi, Professor Block. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for your talk. It was very interesting. I have a question concerning your interpretation of the cases you presented at the beginning, considering that you strongly separate between a perceptual format and cognitive format. Because, for example, I'm thinking about the example of like the image of the cigar in the wall. Like, you seem to accept this kind of example as like an example of some cognitive mechanism, like, for example, the conceptual understanding that there's a cigar in the picture, which seems to have clearly a perceptual effect, right? But then, like, in the literature of people who try to defend a strong difference, like you do between perception and cognition, like those people usually, they also think that the content of our cognitive processes cannot then influence the content of perception. But then, like some of the examples you presented at the beginning seem to contradict this idea. So is your theory then that there are two different formats, but that the cognitive format can influence the perceptual format, like contrary to the classical ideas of like Fodor and Pelican?
Yes. So here was my list. So I have a question mark after the modular, and I put a quasi in front of it. Yeah. So I am giving up on the modular, the architectural. Well, not giving up, but I'm not confident that the Fodor-Pelican way of distinguishing between perception and cognition works. Now, but I wouldn't agree with what you said, which is that cognition influences the format of perception. So the way I think of these things is that the main effect of cognition on perception, the ones where it's most notable, is feature-based attention. We can attend to a single property of something and greatly amplify that thing. And that is especially important when we're looking at an ambiguous stimulus. So I actually have a whole collection of these ambiguous stimuli where you can be told something and then suddenly you see it a different way. So I think what happens is we have, when we have a very strong perceptual drive with an unambiguous stimulus, we just see the stimulus that we cognize the stimulus as it's driven from perception into cognition. But when it's an ambiguous stimulus, there's a lot of room for effects of cognition on perception. And so I think there can be, something in one category can affect something in another category. So I'm not worried about the strong border between perception and cognition just because of the failure of modularity.
Okay, yeah, it's very interesting because it's kind of a new way to make the distinction compared to the classical modularist. Okay, thank you.
Giuliano?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Yeah, I have just two small things. One, with respect to perception of absences, what about perception of wholes? We seem to be pretty good in perceiving wholes, and that all the mechanism behind underpinning it seems to be pretty basic. So, and they seem good candidates for absences. But I mean, that's not trivial, maybe not, but prima facie. And the other thing I was thinking, is there any evidence? So you said like, well, the absence of evidence for there not being conceptual color recognition in kids might be evidence for there not being of the absence of it, and then you show also the evidence with respect to the adults, showing that recognition seems to be even in adults at least passing through perceptual capacities, and I was wondering, I mean, like. So in which sense those two evidence goes in the same direction? Because one might think that, so if we don't have also independent evidence of the fact that kids, maybe because of, so maybe kids, I mean, to put it roughly, they find just more interesting shapes than colors. So that's why they don't use so maybe they have less capacities, less conceptual capacities, and they're developing it, whatever. But given that adults also anyway use anyway the perceptual ones, and kids seems to have it at least after 4 months. So basically, I was just wondering whether there is independent evidence for ruling out that further interpretation of the data.
Yeah. Okay. So the first point about wholes. Look, I don't know much about the perception of wholes. In fact, I know virtually nothing about the perception of wholes, but this result that what the visual system considers an absence, absences do not pop out among presences, but presences do pop out among absences. That's a really well-confirmed result. So I would conclude from that, tentatively anyway, that wholes are not absences as far as the visual system is concerned. The visual system must treat wholes, if we can see wholes, that is, if we can see them in the sense of visually represent them, it must be the visual system is treating them as a positive thing. So on the second question, so you think maybe kids just aren't interested in colors. Well, maybe, we don't really know why they have so much trouble getting the concepts of colors. Now, I'm just offhand, I'd be tempted to say it can't just be lack of interest. The Mabel Rice experiment that I mentioned used 1,000 trials over several weeks to teach these 2-year-olds the difference between red and green. 1,000 trials. Kids like to please adults. When they this Farbendummheit, they must at some level realize that they're not getting what the adult wants them to do. So I don't think I'm not sure how to understand lack of interest. It's certainly lack of noticing, but I think it's something more visual that what? I couldn't hear that. What?
No, I wasn't speaking.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if that helps, but
yeah, that helped a lot. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks.
Louise? Louise Rosca Hardy.
Yeah. Hi, thanks. This is a talk, of course, about the fundamental difference between seeing and thinking. However, your emphasis on categorical perception, your points 4 and 5, made me ask how general is this approach to perception, because certainly in auditory perception, categorical perception is a classic in language, ba and pa, etc. Do you see a connection between, let's say, the approach you've taken to visual perception and other perceptual modalities?
Okay, so I have two answers. One, yes, or maybe three answers. One, yes. Second, I don't know much about the other modalities, but from little I know about audition, I'm really pretty sure the same is true of audition, and I think in particular the voicing difference you mentioned between ba and pa, it's categorical perception, but children get that way before they have any concept of it. In fact, most adults don't have any concept of it. So, I mean, how many adults even know about voicing? So, I think, I'm reasonably certain that that's all. That we give non-conceptual categorical perception in audition as well. There's a lot of really good work on adaptation in vision, and a lot, many of the phenomena found in vision also are known to apply to audition. But that's on my list of things to read up about.
Okay, fine, thanks.
Alberto Voltolini.
Thanks a lot, Ned. At a certain point, you said that you are in favor of the idea that even higher order perception is non-conceptual. And I wonder whether one of the examples that you have provided goes precisely in that direction. I have in mind the example of a non-reversible change, the one that you show at the very beginning, in which, first of all, you seem to see something like a stone in a wall, but then it turns out that in point of fact, you are seeing something like some bits of ash at the end of a cigar. I wonder whether this is a case in which the non-reversibility change is something that might happen completely independent of concept perception. That is, of course, if you possess the concept of a cigar, the concept of ash, and so on and so forth, that such concept might be useful in order to trigger the change, but they are not necessary for that. This is independent of whether Susanna Seeger is right in saying that in that case, what you see is something like a kind property or something more generic, such as a look or a gestalt or whatever. But it seems that concepts are not necessary in that example.
Yes, I agree with that, but I'm not sure. So what I find with the wall cigar thing is if I stare at it for minutes at a time, it reverses. And I'm sure that's a non-conceptual process of, adaptation. And these are familiar in these ambiguous figures, they reverse. However, what I'm not sure of is that it's high level. It might be low level. So now I did say something that does indicate high level non-conceptual perception, I think, which is the fact that a lot of high-level perception, like numerosity, for example, is retinotopic. If it's retinotopic, you really feel that there's a pretty good case that it's non-conceptual too, although it would take a little work to bolster that case. So I think there's plenty of evidence. It's not, I love that evidence from that neuroimage paper a few weeks ago, and I haven't found anything like that for high-level perception. But I think there are strong indicators that high-level perception is also non-conceptual.
Eduardo Arcuri.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello. First of all, thank you for your interesting talk. And following a previous consideration from Giuliano Torrengo's question, I think it was, I would like to ask you your opinion about one alternative way to interpret Anna Franklin's experiments. And I was wondering, does she and her colleagues interpret the data the way you did by drawing a sharp distinction between conceptual categorization and perceptual discrimination abilities? Because as you mentioned, infants are good at spotting differences in shape, for example, at very early stages of development. And you stated that a basic mark of having a concept is at least the capacity of keeping track of something in the environment. I have a concept of, for example, a certain shape, I generalize, I can keep track of that changing over time. And however, what I thought is differences in shapes rests on contrast in light, in brightness and darkness, which in turn rests on different light patterns hitting the retina. So my point is, maybe the infants are good at moving their eyes toward the figures inside the big rectangle. It was the very first experiment you discussed, because they spot a figure, not a different color. I mean, just a difference in contrast. And maybe if we take that also, a major part of the visual cortex is mostly concerned with detecting, for example, motion direction of objects, and along with that to detect shapes and contours of figures. Maybe this study actually demonstrates that color discrimination is something that becomes more salient and important later in life, actually. Maybe for developmental reasons or for social experience, or experience interacting with food or with the environment in general. And maybe the lack of interest, as you said, in color is due to developmental reason in the brain physiology, let's say that. I was wondering what makes you sure you can exclude this hypothesis and so draw a short line between cognition and perceptual abilities in those infants, and then later in the possibility to categorize color and to categorize figures.
Yeah. Okay. So just to begin, your first question is: does Anna Franklin draw these same conclusions? No, she doesn't.
Yeah.
So the work I mentioned the work that I quoted, the work where I relied, the part of the talk where I relied on her work was the part about categorical perception of color in infants. But the work that shows no concepts, that's other people's work. So she doesn't, as far as I know, she doesn't refer to any of those things in any of her work. So she's not guilty of using that argument, using her data this way. So as I understand what your second point was, that you think that what's going on here is when a ball changes into a box, it's as if it's it's as if it was a different thing. So the visual system is, or the conceptual system is saying, "Oh, a new thing," or something like that. Was that the idea?
Yeah, that is the point. The point is maybe they're not so good at keeping track of color in the first place. And in the experiment, in the first experiment of Anna Franklin, when you see the big rectangle with the shape of the different colors inside the rectangle, maybe they're spotting a figure inside the rectangle. And because, as you reported, they're able to do the distinction when there is a very strong distinction among different color categories, but not within category. That also seems to hint to that kind of phenomenon.
So okay, so that would apply to this experiment, but look, you get the same results for this experiment and this experiment, where they use a completely different methodology and there's no change of form. So if the only experiment I had was this one, this is called the tunnel effect, where it looks like one thing is rolling behind and rolls out, maybe you would have a case. But these experiments all use different kinds of stimuli. So I don't think that the idea that it's a new thing really would apply.
Yes, maybe I didn't explain very well. What I was trying to say is that all the other experiments just prove that infants are not really good at spotting colors overall. And
no, it's not that they're not good at spotting colors. Look, the habituation experiments where they get same color, they lose interest, and when it's a new color, their interest rekindles. That shows that they can see the colors, they respond to the colors. What they're bad at is reasoning with colors. Okay, so remember the adaptation experiments. Let me find that. This one. So same color, their interest is rekindled. They see the color, they spot it in that sense. What they're bad at is using the color information to, remember this?
Yes.
Oops, sorry. Where we have one comes out, and then the thing goes down. They don't expect two things. That is an indicator that they can't use color in reasoning. It's not about spotting the colors.
I know, but even in the other experiments where you have all the rectangles of different colors, and what I was saying is that maybe it's not the difference in colors that make them spot them, but it's different in brightness, in contrast.
I see what you're saying. So all these experiments, I mean, look, I'd have to go back and make sure, but they equate for contrast and luminance. So it's a standard in vision science experiments on color to equate for other properties like contrast and luminance. And there's a vast variety of such cases. Maybe some of them were done a while ago were not so good at this, but it would be a journal, at least today, a journal wouldn't publish an article if they didn't equate for other properties.
Okay,
fine. Thank you.
Mehdi, I'm sorry for the. Yes, it's your turn.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to express my happiness being here and your thanks for your wonderful ideas. Since you're talking about color, I'd like to share my ideas of working on your overflow argument. Proposal briefly, since it's related to color perception.
Sure. Sure.
Actually, I have used Stroop stimuli, as you know, Stroop effect, in which we have a colored word and participants should respond to the color of the printed word. And in the, as you know, in incongruent stimuli, we have a decrease in correct responses in comparison to congruent ones. I have used 4 colored words, Stroop stimuli in iconic memory tasks, and in both whole report and partial reports. Okay, and my rationale is that if representations in iconic memory, as you have mentioned in your great papers, are non-conceptual, if they are perceptual and attention-free, we expect that no Stroop effect in encoding and representation of the Stroop stimuli are expected. I'd like to know whether my rationale is correct, and also your opinion about my design of experiment. I can also share, if it is possible, share my stimuli presentation or not. Is it clear?
Look, I think I understand what you're saying. So you have an icon of the word green, but written in red.
Yes.
And so you think that if the perceptions are non-conceptual, you won't get a Stroop effect. Is that what you're saying? Okay, so I don't agree with that at all. I don't agree with that at all. Look, the Stroop effect comes when you report. You are using your concepts. You can have a non-conceptual perception of the letters and the color, but when you make a report, you have to bring in all those conceptual abilities, and you can't stop yourself from coding the color and color concepts. So I think you would get a Stroop. I would predict a Stroop effect.
If there is any significant difference between the responses to correct, to congruent in comparison to incongruent.
Yeah, I would expect that the incongruent ones, that is where the word green is written in red, would be take longer and produce more errors than the one where the word green is written in green, because you have the icon, your image in your mind, and you are then have to apply your conceptual abilities to that image to generate a response. You have to, you have to conceptualize the colors in your mind, so and form a judgment about them, and then that's where the Stroop effect would come in.
So it does not directly assess the any phenomenality or concluding that iconic memory is not attention free, because we have attentional bias to word processing.
Look, here's the problem in doing experiments. You for the non-conceptual nature of perception, is that responses always require conception. In an experiment with an adult verbal subject, you get a response only when you form a judgment about what you're seeing. You decide, I'm seeing this rather than seeing that, so I should press this button rather than that button. So you're always bringing your concepts in. And that's why I think people have not realized that experiments can actually be relevant to whether perception is non-conceptual. So the experiments that I talked about, the interesting and cool thing is they use nonverbal techniques that don't require the subjects to actually do anything. They just are, they're just doing whatever they're just moving their eyes in a pretty automatic way. So you can get an indication of non-conceptual perception that avoids this problem we have in doing experiments on anything to show anything non-conceptual, which is that a response in a standard psychology experiment always requires concepts and judgments.
Thank you very much.
Are there further questions? So we are in our time we are 8:15, and may I just a very short question, Ned?
Sure.
Is about the categorical perception, and is about also the possibility to make your claim or to extend your claim or higher order perceptual features, so more than color. For instance, there are many interesting experiments with infants, 6 months, exactly as for the color. 6-8 months children are able to categorize different kind of action when they are observing, for instance, another children or an adults reaching for and grasping an object instead of another target. are looking time experiments, so they are surprised. They are not surprised if the actor is changing the trajectory, but achieving the same kind of action, but are more surprised if they are performing the same, they are having the same trajectory with the movements, but they are performing another, achieving another goal, so reaching another target. And that's interesting because it seems to suggest that they have a kind of a categorical perception of action type. But it's really hard to, we have no experiments that demonstrate they have no concept about action or action goals on something like that. But what is really interesting is that even monkeys are able to do the same. And that's, we don't need to postulate conceptual abilities in order to explain perceptual, categorical perception of action type. That's could be an interesting point, because that's really interesting, because you don't need to postulate that infants are able to reasoning about goals, because reasoning about goals is much more complicated. And that is just categorizing action type or action outcome, if you like, but not, there is no need to postulate. Of course, differently from your staff, there are no experiment that are testing the no conceptual abilities about this, because usually people don't think that they have to demonstrate that people don't have concept in order to achieve this kind of categorical perception. But this could be an interesting topic, maybe to
Yeah, so I know this work. I actually heard a talk by the person who did that work, and I've forgotten her name, Amanda something. Amanda Woodward, yeah. So yeah, that's really cool stuff. And look, this is what motivates the ideas that the ideas of Susan Carey and Elizabeth Spelke on core cognition. Now, I don't know whether this is perceptual or conceptual, but it certainly looks like they have some appreciation of intentionality and what the goal of the moving the hand is. And, work on mirror neurons suggests the same thing in animals. There's a strong reason to think that they have this appreciation. Whether it's conceptual or non-conceptual, I don't know.
Yeah. If you use your argument in terms of timing, so that's
that would be very relevant. I'd like to know how fast they do it.
The response is the brain response is very fast.
Yeah. So right. Yeah.
It's like the same as you demonstrate just for color. It's very very fast. And that could be an interesting. So just using your logic. So just using the logic of your argument to say, okay, we can go to higher order perceptual categorization, and then could be very nice to extend. Thank you, Ned. I'm very
well, thank you so much. I got great questions. A great discussion. I'm so pleased to have had this experience.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you to everybody. Let me just remind that we will have 2 meetings in June. 9 June, we have a meeting with Stefano Zucca, and the specific meeting, especially for the young people, but not only young people, is academic stressors and how to deal with them. That is hard time for the academic people. And the other talk will be by Tamara Makin. The 22 June is a technological embodiment. So I will invite to all of you for these talks. And let me say thank all of you for being here this evening, and especially Ned for accepting our invitation and giving so marvelous talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.